Monday morning broke over Brookstone Academy with that peculiar hush that comes before a summer storm, a sky the color of pewter pressed low against the brick and glass, and yet, inside the corridors, the air was charged with a current that made the hair on people's arms lift when they touched the handrails. Students pretended to rummage in lockers while watching the front entrance. Teachers shuffled papers already read twice, and the intercom remained stubbornly, ominously silent until the squeak of rubber solace cut through the lobby in Grace Jackson uniform. Clean, jaw set, eyes steady, walked through the doors with the posture of someone who has scrubbed floors long enough to know what truly makes a building stand. Not marble, not donor plaques, not press releases, but the quiet insistence of ordinary hands doing honest work. Maya walked at her side in that too-large blazer, the faint silvered line above her eyebrow like a moon sliver declaring the tide had turned. And when a student held the door too long and a teacher reached to say she was suspended, Agent Ramirez materialized from the vestibule bench with two colleagues and a folder, nodded once to Grace, then to the principal waiting in the hallway with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and in the space of a few sentences the script flipped. The Academy no longer a stage for pageantry, but a scene for inventory, for counting what was real and what was performed. The agents split like water around a rock, one toward the server room, one to accounting, Ramirez to the principal's office where Henley's framed diplomas looked suddenly like props. And as doors opened and closed with the soft punctuation of official business, the rumor wind rose first years whispering into sleeves, seniors pretending they knew how this would end because they were months away from the world and believed themselves fluent in endings. What they didn't understand, what few ever do, is that change doesn't arrive as a speech or a single headline. It arrives as 1,000 tiny sounds, the hum of a copier loaded with subpoenas, the clack of a keyboard pulling ledgers from the ghosted corners of a shared drive, the hollow echo of a trophy case as someone peels off a donor's nameplate, and somewhere in that soundscape a girl clears her throat, not to be brave exactly, but to be exact. May asked Agent Ramirez whether she could sit in during interviews, not to speak, just to listen, and Ramirez hesitated because there are rules and optics and all the reasons adults invent to put courage on hold. But then she remembered the ledger of her own years and the way truth doesn't always come with permission slips. So she nodded and said yes. And Maya stood against the wall like a sentinel, while Ms. Viga tried to sound offended by the notion that numbers could lie. Then softer, smaller, when presented with the emails where those numbers learned to lie. And in the pause after each printed page slid across the desk, Grace heard the sound she had been waiting her whole life to hear, the sound of certainty wearing down, of authority being asked to show its work. Outside, in the cafeteria where windows framed the leaden sky, someone had taped Maya's ethics forum speech beside the menu board, and students gathered not to gawk but to read, their fingers tracing lines as if they were braille for a future that wanted spelling out. And even the kitchen staff, hairnets shining like halos under fluorescent lights, read in shifts and nodded as if recognizing an ingredient by scent alone. Around noon, a courier arrived with a battered cardboard box marked Archives 2018 to 2021. And the receptionist, who had answered phones here long enough to know which names get announced and which get waved through, routed it to accounting, where Agent Ortiz lifted the lid and found rows of manila folders with the precise, sterile handwriting of someone who believes neatness is a synonym for innocence. And yet, inside the tidy sleeves, the ghosts danced duplicate invoices stamped days apart, shell entities sharing mailing addresses with luxury condos, contracts for events that photos proved never happened. It's strange the way paper, when gathered, becomes chorus, how a single sheet is a whisper, but a stack is a hymn, and the hymn rising that day was not angry but resolute. Not vindictive, but exacting, and when Ramirez finally stepped into the corridor to breathe and found Grace there, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were the pale of dawn, she asked if she was all right, and Grace, who had lifted mop water and grief and expectations for so long they'd grown the same weight, said that all right wasn't the measure anymore. Dignity was, and if that meant sitting in this hallway while the building acknowledged the truth, then yes, she would call that dignity. Somewhere above, on the fourth floor outside the library, a student string quartet began practicing for an assembly that might never happen now, and their first hesitant notes braided with the printer's whir and the clock's patient tick, into something that felt like an overture to the life Maya had imagined when she told the auditorium that words matter more when people expect you not to have them. Around 2, the doors of the principal's office opened, and Henley walked out with that dazed, years-older look of a man who has just learned that a story is not something he tells, but something he participates in. And when he saw Grace, he offered a smile that was not apology and not quite gratitude either, and she let it pass because she had learned the hard way that some redemption belongs to the work, not the words. By 3, storm clouds finally let down their rain in a sheet that polished the sidewalks and smeared the chalk hearts someone had drawn near the entrance. And in that rain, Maya stood beneath the awning with Ava and 2 boys from physics who had once snickered at her when she raised her hand too often. And they didn't say much because the day had already said so much, but one of the boys cleared his throat and asked if she might, when this was over, help him understand how she followed the money. And Maya, who knew now that leadership is sometimes a syllabus, said, "Sure. Bring your questions and bring an appetite because Grace makes the best grilled cheese in the city." And the 3 of them laughed in that grateful way laughter breaks through after a long-held breath. Evening came early, as it does on days like that, and the agents packed carefully labeled evidence into boxes, while the building creaked in all the places only the maintenance staff ever notice. And before they left, Ramirez approached Grace and Maya by the custodial closet where it all began for them, buckets, brooms, bottles in their upright ranks, and said that what happens next will be slow and public and sometimes unfair in how it unfolds, but that the center of it, the axis that keeps the wheel from flying apart, is the fact that a girl told the truth and a mother stood beside her long enough for the truth to be heard. And as they stepped out into the rinse-blue evening, the storm's last drops freckling the stoop, the streetlight that had stuttered for years outside their apartment flickered in Maya's mind like a metronome, counting a tempo she could finally dance to. And she looked at her mother, at the hands that had kept the school shining when no one thought to look down at the floors they walked on, and she understood utterly that power is not the noise someone makes when they enter a room, it's the quiet that remains when their noise is done, the stillness that belongs to people who know what they're worth without anyone announcing it. So they walked home not as fugitives from a machine, but as authors of an addendum to the city's old script. And Maya planned out loud how the ethics club she would start could teach 7th graders to audit promises, the way you audit books. And Grace listened with that secret smile of mothers who have learned to let the world catch up to the child it tried to underestimate. And by the time they reached their building's front steps, the rain had halted, the gutters sang thin silver songs, and the air clean damp, bright with the faint tang of ozone, smelled like something the city rarely gives without extracting a cost. A new beginning, paid for not in blood or blame, but in exacting, patient truth. Upstairs, Grace taped a blank sheet of paper to the refrigerator and wrote at the top with a thick-tipped marker the marble crack pledge, and below it, in her neatest print, 3 lines they would both sign before bed. I will use my words to lift. I will stand even when I shake. I will count what is real. And when they signed, the ink bled a little because of the humidity, and Maya laughed that the city itself wanted to join their signatures. And Grace, who believed now more than ever that buildings do hold their breath, put her hand to the wall and felt the old plaster, warm beneath her palm, like the heartbeat of a place that had finally learned what kind of strength it should be built to protect. The days that followed unfolded with the slow intensity of a curtain rising, the city no longer whispering but listening, and Brookstone Academy transforming from a school of polished appearances into the reluctant epicenter of a storm that refused to quiet down. Yet in the Jackson household, life kept its familiar rhythm in small but sacred rituals, Grace rising early to put oatmeal on the stove, Maya spreading her notes across the table with the precision of an archivist, and outside their window the streetlight, which had flickered uncertainly for months, now burned steady, as though the city itself was stubborn enough to hold its own vigil. What set this week apart, however, was not the silence of shame or the gossip of neighbors, but the deliberate attention of people who had once dismissed them. Local reporters called, community organizers knocked on their door, and the superintendent of schools convened a press conference where cameras hummed and microphones clustered like bees, while Mayo's name was mentioned not with pity but with reverence, a student whistleblower. They called her a child of integrity, and though Grace cringed at the spotlight because she knew that praise was often a prelude to exploitation, she also saw the way her daughter's eyes gleamed, not out of vanity, but out of recognition. That she had at last been heard. By midweek, the billionaire himself could no longer ignore the headlines. Laurent Morrow sat in his penthouse office surrounded by lawyers and public relations executives who spoke in the language of damage control, their words looping around strategy and optics, while Morrow's gaze remained fixed on the skyline as if he could bully the city into forgetting. But cities do not forget. They archive in their sidewalks, in their conversations, in the way children repeat names with awe or contempt. And this time the city had chosen to remember Maya when his counsel suggested discrediting the girl as naive. He barked that 12-year-olds do not dismantle foundations with this kind of precision, and in that bark was the faint tremor of fear that wealth cannot disguise. For the first time in his career, his money had not bought silence, and silence was his favorite currency. He turned from the window to the long table and asked what he had never asked before, "What if she is right?" And the quiet that followed was heavier than the storm clouds building outside, a silence that no spin doctor could fill. Meanwhile, in the narrow halls of Brookstone, students began to see themselves differently. What had once been a story about a janitor's daughter had transformed into a parable about possibility, and lockers once plastered with glossy posters of sports heroes now bore photocopied excerpts of Maya's forum speech, taped crookedly but proudly. Teachers, too, began adjusting syllabi, sliding in lessons about civil courage and ethics not because the curriculum demanded it but because their conscience did, and Grace, though still mopping floors with the same quiet diligence, noticed the way conversations hushed when she entered, not out of disdain, but out of the uneasy respect that people reserve for those who have reminded them of their own complicity. The shift was subtle, like the first crack in ice before a thaw, but it was real. And Grace told herself that dignity was not always loud. It was sometimes the hush that falls when truth is acknowledged. On Friday evening, as rain slicked the pavement and neon signs blurred in puddles, Grace and Maya were invited to a neighborhood forum at a local community center, a gathering not of officials or journalists but of parents, workers, and children who wanted to say aloud that they saw them, that they believed them. Folding chairs filled the hall. The smell of strong coffee mingled with damp coats, and when Maya was urged to speak, she did not deliver a rehearsed speech, but told a story of watching her mother clean classrooms while others walked by without eye contact, of realizing that silence was a weapon used against the unseen, of choosing to read documents not because she wanted power, but because she wanted fairness. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but warm, layered with gratitude, the kind that carries into the marrow, and Grace felt tears press against her eyes, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she recognized the rare purity of a moment when community and truth met without agenda. That night, walking home through streets still glistening from the rain, Maya whispered that she finally understood what power meant. It wasn't standing on a stage with cameras. It was standing on cracked sidewalks with people who nodded, who understood, who carried your words into their own conversations. And yet, beneath this rising tide of support, shadows lengthened. Anonymous letters continued to appear, sometimes slipped under their door, sometimes taped to lockers, warnings written in blocky letters, "Stop now," or "We know where you live." Grace reported them, Maya saved them, but neither allowed them to shape their steps. Though at night Grace often lay awake listening to every creak in the hallway, her heart braced against a knock that might mean more than mail. One evening, after a particularly sharp threat arrived folded inside Maya's math textbook, Grace sat her daughter down and told her that courage is not the absence of fear. It is walking through fear without letting it dictate your destination. And Maya listened, nodding with a gravity far beyond her age. then whispered back, "If they're this scared of me, that means I'm exactly where I need to be." Grace wanted to protest, to protect, but she realized that her daughter was no longer asking for permission to be brave. She was demanding the space to live brave. By the time the second week ended, federal auditors had seized servers, community leaders had demanded hearings, and the Morrow Foundation's name, once spoken with reverence, now tasted bitter in the city's mouth. Grace still scrubbed tiles, Maya still filled notebooks with careful observations, but everything had changed. They were no longer invisible. Invisibility had been their shield and their cage, but now the world saw them, and with that sight came danger, yes, but also the fragile promise of change. And so, as they sat together at their kitchen table, a single lamp casting amber light over bowls of reheated soup, Grace reached across, held her daughter's ink-stained fingers, and said that the fight was far from over, but that the hardest part being heard was already won, and Maya, eyes steady, scar glinting faintly, replied that being heard was only the beginning, that the real victory would come when truth was not extraordinary but expected, not courageous but ordinary. In that moment, mother and daughter, janitor and child, were no longer just participants in a scandal, they were authors of a new narrative, one that no billionaire could erase, and though the world outside plotted its strategies, within their small apartment the air pulsed with something larger than fear, larger than wealth, larger than the storm that had started it all. Conviction, the third chapter of their journey, did not arrive with fireworks or headlines, but with the quiet weight of inevitability, the kind of weight that presses down on a city's chest when truth refuses to return to silence. It began on a Monday morning, with the faint smell of wet pavement seeping through the cracked window of the Jackson apartment, the city humming with a different tone than before. Grace had risen before dawn as she always did, sweeping floors and packing lunches with the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago learned that survival is built from repetition. But now each movement carried a new layer of meaning. Every sweep of her mop, every stroke of her rag seemed to whisper into the marble floors of Brookstone Academy that those who had been unseen were now undeniable. Maya, seated at the small kitchen table with her notebook already open, scribbled notes with a relentless energy that made her mother both proud and deeply uneasy. The child's handwriting, neat but firm, stretched across the page with a conviction that would shame many adults, and in each sentence Grace recognized the formation of something larger than personal courage. It was the formation of history. The world outside their door was catching up with them in fits and starts. The local newspaper had run another story about the audit, and radio hosts debated whether it was embarrassing or inspiring that a 12-year-old girl had seen what experts and auditors had missed for years. In grocery stores, neighbors who had once nodded politely but kept their distance now leaned in to whisper encouragement, slipping notes into Grace's pocket or candy into Maya's hand as if these small tokens could repay the debt of her defiance. Yet, with the warmth came the cold draft of menace. The envelopes kept arriving, some scrawled with threats, others with cryptic warnings, and though the police logged them, the fear lingered in the cracks of their apartment like a stubborn draft. Grace tried to hide her worry, but Maya saw it, in the way her mother double-checked locks and glanced at shadows too long. Still, when confronted, Grace would lift her chin and say that fear cannot mop your floors or feed your children, so it had no seat in her home. At Brookstone, the atmosphere had shifted from uneasy silence to something far more complicated. Teachers no longer avoided Grace in the hallways. Some nodded with tentative respect, while others carried guilt in their eyes, as though realizing their complicity in years of unspoken prejudice. Students, too, behaved differently. Some admired Maya, slipping her folded notes of solidarity, while others avoided her as though proximity to courage might invite danger. In one hallway, a group of seniors taped up a handwritten sign, "Courage is contagious." Beneath it, someone else had scrawled, "So is fear." The school had become a mirror of the larger world, a place where people chose daily between standing tall or stepping aside, between acknowledging the truth or pretending not to see it. The billionaire, meanwhile, retreated deeper into the cold architecture of his empire. Laurent Morrow, once so certain of his untouchable image, now spent his mornings staring at news feeds that no longer echoed his narrative but dissected it. He had built his fortune not merely on business but on the performance of benevolence, wrapping exploitation in the soft paper of philanthropy. Now that paper was tearing, and the hands tugging at it belonged not to competitors or politicians, but to a janitor's daughter whose scarred brow had become a symbol. His lawyers urged him to settle, to silence the story with money, but Morrow knew instinctively that this was a battle money could not buy him out of. He was not fighting Maya Jackson the student. He was fighting what she represented, a future where children questioned authority, where power was asked to show its receipts, where marble cracked not with hammers but with words. It was during this fragile week that an unexpected letter arrived for Maya, not delivered by threat or courier but by hand, passed to her quietly by Mr. Price, the social studies teacher who had always watched from the edges. Inside the envelope was a simple invitation, an inter-school youth summit on ethics and leadership, organized hastily by a coalition of local schools that wanted to turn the spark into a flame. Maya read it 3 times before handing it to her mother, her heart pounding, not with fear but with recognition. This was not just about her anymore. Grace studied the letter in silence, then looked at her daughter with eyes that brimmed with both warning and pride. She reminded Maya that standing in front of more people meant greater danger, but Maya, with a calmness that belonged to someone decades older, said that danger was not new to them. What was new was the possibility that their words could ripple outward. The summit took place in a modest auditorium with scuffed floors and folding chairs. Nothing like the marble grandeur of Brookstone, yet it vibrated with a kind of electricity that marble halls rarely knew, the electricity of authenticity. Students from different boroughs filled the room, some with handwritten posters, others with nothing but wide eyes. When Maya stepped onto the stage, wearing the same blazer borrowed weeks ago, the crowd hushed in that particular way that marks the beginning of something important. She spoke not of herself but of patterns, how exploitation always cloaked itself in respectability, how silence was always demanded from those least able to afford it, how truth was not a luxury but a responsibility. Her words, though simple, cut through the air like clean water through dust, and as she spoke even the skeptical faces softened, realizing that this was not a child reciting lines but a witness giving testimony. Grace sat in the back row, her calloused hands folded, her heart torn between the urge to shield and the need to let her daughter fly. She noticed the reporters scribbling notes, the cameras clicking, but more than that, she noticed the students leaning forward, their bodies bending toward Maya's as though drawn by gravity. When the speech ended, the applause was not a roar but a steady, rhythmic clapping that grew stronger with each beat, like a drum summoning courage. Grace felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition that something irreversible had happened. Her daughter was no longer just a girl with a scar. She was a voice, and voices, once freed, do not return to silence. That evening, as they walked home through the cooling twilight, Maya carried the folded program from the summit tucked into her pocket, her fingers tracing the creases as if sealing a promise to herself. Grace, walking beside her, said little, but at the doorway of their apartment, she turned to her daughter and whispered that she should never confuse applause with change, that the real work was slower, harder, and often lonelier. Maya nodded, understanding, and replied that she was ready for that kind of work. Together they climbed the stairs, their shadows stretching long on the wall, 2 figures bound not just by blood but by the shared knowledge that they had cracked something open in a world that preferred to remain sealed, and that once a crack exists, light has no choice but to enter. The 4th part of their story unfolded not like a sudden thunderclap but like a slow-burning fire, the kind that begins in hidden corners and spreads steadily until even the most fortified walls can no longer contain it. By now, the name Maya Jackson had traveled far beyond the classrooms of Brookstone Academy and into living rooms, newsrooms, and boardrooms across the city. What had begun as a confrontation between a billionaire's arrogance and a janitor's dignity had swelled into a narrative larger than any one family could have predicted. And though Grace often wished for nothing more than a quiet return to anonymity, she also understood that history has little interest in the comfort of those it chooses to elevate. Each morning, when she pulled her uniform over her tired shoulders and tied her hair back with the same practical care she always had, she knew the building she entered was no longer merely a workplace. It had become an arena, and every glance, every silence, every whisper carried weight. The billionaire, Laurent Morrow, sat ensnared in his own empire, the marble and glass of his corporate tower reflecting back not his confidence but his isolation. Each day his advisors arrived with thick folders and polished reassurances, but each day the headlines chipped away at their veneer. The audits had uncovered inconsistencies too large to dismiss, and the narrative that his foundation had been little more than a shell for tax evasion was spreading like wildfire. Morrow still spoke in the language of control, threats of litigation, whispers of character assassination, promises of counter-campaigns, but the tremor in his hands betrayed what his words refused to admit. The child he had once dismissed had become the fulcrum on which his reputation now balanced. Late at night, as the city lights bled into his penthouse office, he would stare at the skyline and imagine cracks running through the towers, fractures that mirrored the one that had already split his carefully curated image. At Brookstone Academy, the weight of the scandal pressed down on everyone, from the headmaster in his corner office to the cafeteria workers serving mashed potatoes under flickering lights. Students who had once mocked Maya now carried themselves differently, as though realizing that their laughter had been borrowed from a script written by those who wanted her silent. Teachers altered their lessons, inserting questions about justice, courage, and integrity into discussions that had once centered on grammar and dates. Even the custodial staff, who had long worked in invisibility, felt a strange shift. Where once their presence had been tolerated, now it carried an aura of respect. Grace noticed it in the smallest ways: a door held longer than usual, a nod that lingered, an acknowledgement that her labor was not beneath the marble, but the foundation that held it. Yet she also knew that respect born of scandal was fragile, easily withdrawn once the news cycle turned, and so she reminded herself each night that her worth had never needed headlines to exist. The threats, however, did not stop. If anything, they grew sharper, more desperate. Anonymous letters escalated into phone calls, voices distorted but venom clear, warning Grace to rein in her daughter before things went too far. One evening, a brick wrapped in paper scrawled with threats shattered the small window near their fire escape, showering glass across the kitchen floor. Grace's heart clenched with fear, but Maya, standing barefoot among the shards, refused to flinch. Instead, she picked up the paper, read it once, and placed it neatly into the folder where she kept every piece of intimidation, labeling it as evidence. They wouldn't fight this hard if they weren't afraid, she told her mother, her voice steady. Grace wanted to argue, to gather her daughter into her arms and shield her from every harm, but deep down she recognized the truth. The battle had already chosen them, and retreat was no longer an option. The city, too, was shifting under the weight of truth. At town halls and neighborhood meetings, parents and teachers began speaking Maya's name with pride, framing her courage as a call to action. Community groups organized petitions demanding transparency from not only Morrow's foundation, but other philanthropies whose glossy brochures had long gone unquestioned. Local journalists who had once struggled to find an audience for stories about school budgets and funding inequities now found their articles trending, fueled by Maya's example. Even national outlets began to circle, drawn by the unlikely story of vindication crashing against the marble walls. Morrow stood frozen, his face a mask of fury he could no longer disguise. And for the first time, it was clear to everyone in the room. The billionaire had been defeated not in court, not in boardrooms, but in the arena of truth, by the voice of a child. That night, back in their apartment, Grace and Maya sat quietly over bowls of soup, the noise of the day still echoing in their ears. Grace reached across the table, took her daughter's hand, and said softly that the empire of lies had begun to collapse, but their work was not yet done. Maya nodded, her eyes weary but alight, and replied that she understood that breaking The marble was only the beginning, and now they had to build something stronger in its place. Outside, the streetlight that had long flickered finally glowed steady, casting a golden pool of light over the sidewalk below, as if the city itself had decided to stand guard for the long road still ahead. The sixth and final part of their story unfolded not as a triumphant ending neatly tied with ribbons, but as a dawn messy, glowing, filled with both shadows and promises. By the time the hearings commenced in the echoing halls of the federal courthouse, the name Maya Jackson had traveled far beyond Brooklyn and New York City. It had been carried into households across the country, spoken in classrooms, debated on talk shows, and etched into editorials as the symbol of a new kind of courage. The courthouse itself had become a stage, with cameras lined outside and protesters holding placards that read "Truth Matters" and "Children Shouldn't Have to Fight for Justice." Grace walked up the courthouse steps hand in hand with her daughter, the weight of the world pressing on their shoulders, but their steps steady, their gazes unbroken. She wore her janitor's shoes polished clean, as though to declare that dignity doesn't need disguises, and Maya, still small in her blazer, carried no notes, only the same notebook she had filled from the beginning, the one lined with translations. Figures and fragments of truth inside the hearings unfolded like theater, the grandeur of the marble pillars contrasting with the raw humanity of testimony. Former employees spoke of forged invoices, of pressure to falsify reports, of donations funneled into real estate instead of classrooms. Auditors laid out spreadsheets on glowing screens, each number unraveling the illusion of generosity that Morrow had peddled for years. And then it was Maya's turn. The room stilled as she was sworn in, the youngest voice in the chamber, but the one everyone had come to hear. She spoke slowly, carefully, not for spectacle but for clarity, recounting how she had first encountered the fraudulent document, how she had traced the inconsistencies, how she had refused to remain silent even when threatened. "I'm not here because I wanted to be," she said, her eyes sweeping across the chamber, posing briefly on Morrow, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. "I'm here because silence lets people like him win, and I couldn't let silence do the work anymore." Her words did not thunder. They resonated, like a note struck on a piano that lingers long after the key is released. Grace sat in the gallery, her chest tight, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. She thought of every night scrubbing floors until her back ached, of every moment she had told her daughter to keep her head down, of every humiliation endured in silence. And now, that silence had transformed into a voice so undeniable that the most powerful man in the room could not answer it. When the session adjourned for the day, reporters swarmed, microphones pressed forward. But Grace pulled her daughter close and shielded her, whispering that they had said enough for now, that sometimes power is knowing when to walk away. Outside, the city itself seemed to breathe differently. The crowds were no longer there to jeer or to gawk, they were there to support. Neighbors who had once overlooked them stood shoulder to shoulder with activists and teachers, their applause not for spectacle but for solidarity. Even in places where their story was debated or dismissed, there was no longer the comfort of ignorance. People had been forced to look, and once you have seen, you cannot unsee. Morrow, meanwhile, retreated into the shrinking walls of his empire. His board abandoned him, his lawyers distanced themselves. His foundation froze under investigation, and his name, once a symbol of prestige, had become shorthand for deceit. He remained in his penthouse, staring out at a city that no longer bent to him, realizing that his true defeat was not in the courtroom but in the hearts and minds of those who now believed a janitor's daughter more than they ever believed him. For Grace and Maya, the days that followed were quieter, but not without meaning. They returned to their modest apartment, to oatmeal in the mornings and soup in the evenings, to the rituals that had always carried them. Grace still mopped floors, though with a new kind of recognition from those around her, but she never sought their approval. Her dignity had never depended on it. Maya returned to school, and while some students still avoided her, others sought her out, not for gossip but for guidance, asking how to stand when standing felt impossible. Teachers invited her into discussions not as a novelty, but as a peer. She was still 12, still young, still growing, But she carried herself with the calm gravity of someone who understood that her words had cracked something larger than marble. They had cracked the silence of a system. One evening, weeks after the hearings began, Maya sat at the kitchen table surrounded by her notebooks, her head bent over a new speech she had been asked to give at a local youth conference. Grace watched her, the lamplight falling softly over the scar on her brow, and felt both pride and fear. She walked over, placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders, and said, "Baby, you've already done more than anyone could ask of you. You don't have to keep proving yourself." Maya looked up, her eyes steady, and replied, "I'm not proving myself. I'm making sure no one forgets what we started." Grace wanted to argue, but she stopped because deep down she knew her daughter was right. Change does not stay lit on its own. It needs voices to tend the flame. On a warm spring afternoon, months later, Brookstone Academy held an assembly not to celebrate donors or ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but to honor voices of courage. The gymnasium was filled with students, teachers, and staff, and on the stage stood Grace and Maya, invited not as background figures but as central guests. When Maya was called forward, she did not read a speech. Instead, she spoke 3 simple sentences that silenced the room. "I was told to stay quiet. I chose to speak. And I hope every one of you knows you can too." The applause that followed was not just sound, it was recognition, a collective acknowledgement that something had shifted, not just in the marble of one academy, but in the consciousness of a community. That night, as Grace and Maya walked home under a sky streaked with the colors of sunset, they paused by the streetlight outside their building, the one that had flickered for years, but now shone steady. Grace tilted her head toward it and smiled faintly. "Funny how that light finally learned to stay on," she murmured. Maya looked up at it, her eyes reflecting its glow, and replied, "Maybe it was waiting for us." They entered their apartment, hand in hand, not as janitor and daughter, not as symbols or headlines, but simply as 2 people who had dared to demand dignity and had discovered that even the smallest voices, when spoken with truth, can split marble and let the light through.